This is officially my last day of the wellness journey, the 7 day kind of challenge, let's call it, from Magic Mind. And I think I shared last time that, I've already been drinking the Magic Mind mental performance shot every single day. So actually, I guess this is kind of like day number 14. If I'm trying to think back. Yeah, I think it's day number 14. And seriously, I actually did not have any coffee today. I only had my Magic Mind mental performance shot. And, at some point when you're used to having caffeine in the morning, it kind of sets you up for your day. But Magic Mind has really replaced this for me. And to me, it's like a healthier alternative too, because it's not as much caffeine and it's loaded with wonderful, amazing, healthy ingredients. And so, of course, when I think back to what I shared over these last few weeks, that as a mom of twins, and of course, it's the winter, you can hear I've been congested in every single episode for the last 2 months. I've needed to just kind of plow through things, and Magic Mind is the thing that has gotten me through, literally. And I don't feel like I'm hitting a wall as much anymore. I really feel like I've found a lot of balance, and I found my focus again, and I was just feeling so out of focus. So this shift in mindset and really working with Magic Mind has totally opened my eyes, and I'm really grateful that not only that they've decided to work with me, but also that they challenged me to drink it every single day, because even though I was doing that already, once you're working with someone, you can't mess up, so I'm like, okay, I can't miss a day. And so now I'm basically on day 14, and I don't know, I feel I think the biggest thing is that I feel more focused. Um, and then on top of that, I have the energy to match my focus, which is great. And this is probably the first day where I had my mental performance shot without coffee, and it's amazing. I honestly don't know that I need coffee when I have the mental performance shot, even though it doesn't replace it. It's just the coffee was kind of like a crutch, whereas now I'm actually starting to get focus again. So thanks, Magic Mind. For my listeners who also want to invest in their mental wealth, Magic Mind is offering 48% off your first subscription or 20% off one-time purchases with code HUMANHR20 at checkout. Go to magicmind.com/humanhr and use code HUMANHR20. That's magicmind.com/humanhr with code HUMANHR20 for 48% off your first subscription or 20% off your one-time purchases.
Welcome to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast. I'm Traci Chernoff, and I've spent my entire professional career in HR. Each week, we'll explore the delicate balance between people and business with the aim to reconnect the two and create meaningful outcomes. Listen in as I share my own experiences, challenge the status quo, and chat with guests from various industries about our mission to bring the human back to human resources.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here for another week. This week, a long-awaited episode all about DE&I. And this is we're recording this only a few days before this episode publishes. So everything that you hear today will be through as of the end of February 14th, the very end of the day, hopefully, assuming that nothing changes in the next few hours. Before I really even get into the intro to introduce you to our guest this week, who's going to help me tremendously in talking about this very important subject, I wanted to let you know that actually Brian, who is our guest this week, he and I are going to be doing a Policy Pulse episode. It's almost let's call it a series. We're tracking for and planning for one episode per month, at least while a lot of policies are changing, potentially, or while a lot of things are coming up. And I have to give credit to Brian. This was his idea, and I think it's a great one because, there's a lot to talk about. And this way, if something changes, the information that you're receiving is not super old. And we can kind of try and keep up with things, especially considering most of you are in HR and really get a tremendous benefit, I think, from being on top of or in the know with different policies and changes and things like that. So with that said, I've already teased Bryan to you, but let me introduce you to Bryan, or actually reintroduce you if you've been listening to the podcast for a number of years now. Bryan Driscoll has been on my podcast. He was on, I think it was episode 147 back in 2023. And he's back on because he's, in my mind, our resident attorney and support, legal support, let's say, for the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast, at least for me, in my mind. So, Bryan Driscoll is a non practicing lawyer, HR consultant, and legal content writer. As an HR consultant, Bryan helps businesses navigate complex workplace challenges, ensuring compliance while fostering fair, people centric workplaces. He also coaches individual workers and job seekers, empowering them to advocate for themselves, understanding their rights, and navigating career transitions with confidence. On the legal content writing side, Bryan crafts authoritative, high impact content for law firms and legal publications. His work has been featured in major publications including Best Lawyers, Newsweek, and Forbes, earning him recognition as a trusted voice in workers' rights, employment law, HR compliance, and business strategy. Bryan, I am truly so grateful that you and I remained in contact and that you were so open to coming on the podcast and talking about DE&I and everything surrounding DE&I with me. And I know that there are some housekeeping items that we have. So I'm going to pass the mic to you before we get started.
Well, thank you, Traci. Yes, it's wonderful to be back, and yes, to keep in touch over the years. I'm excited about the policy polls too. I think it'll help everybody sort of stay on top of everything that's changing as we move through the first few months of this new administration. I would say that right off the bat, everything that we talk about is going to be good general advice, but for specific questions that any listeners may have, for specific issues or guidance for their business, that's something they need to reach out to their employment lawyer or to an HR advisor and consultant like myself to help give them more specific direction, more insight onto their exact needs. So that's my little disclaimer. Can't ever take the lawyer hat off. So I had to give that.
Nor should you. Keep it on. We need it. No, thank you for that. And I'm sure that everyone appreciates the disclaimer and that understanding. And I also kind of want to add a little bit of an asterisk also to this disclaimer, which has nothing to do with the legal side of things, but rather, I want everyone to really listen to this episode, not necessarily with an open mind, but with through a lens of, objectivity. Because of course, when we talk about topics like DE&I, we rightfully impart our own feelings and emotions because of whether we are a marginalized group or a specific gender or age or whatever it might be, whatever DE&I means to you. And obviously, we're going to break down all of that because that's like the tippy top of an iceberg in terms of what diversity even is. But really, I would just love for everyone listening to this episode to really listen. And if you have a deeply held belief on either side of what we would call the political spectrum, that's fine. You can have that deeply held belief. You do not have to be, on one side of the fence or the other in order to listen to or appreciate this podcast. All beliefs are pretty much welcome here. And certainly, I really think that if we can all come into our listening ears with a very open mind, then we'll be able to really get a strong grasp of what's going on, figure out the impact, what we do with some of these changes, if we have to do anything. And we're going to jump into all of this, but I think it's a really important thing that we all just, take a breath and really work to understand and truly listen to pretty much every single thing that's going to come up on this episode. We're not going to cover everything. It's impossible. We'll have you here for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours, and you won't like us very much. So we're going to probably and hopefully cover the most impactful or the most spoken about aspects of some of these recent things. I don't even know what the right term is. Is it a thing? It's probably just a thing, right? Because it's not necessarily in practice yet or not. So I don't want to jump too far ahead. Do you have anything to add to that, Bryan?
I would also just add that I want to sort of address the elephant in the room here, and that is me being a white guy talking about all this stuff. I could easily sit back and say, not my problem. But at least from my perspective, that's why I need to be speaking up. The folks who look like me are the ones who most likely will benefit from any DEI rollbacks. And so it's up to the people who are the beneficiaries of those rollbacks to speak up and say, this is not okay. And that's sort of my perspective on all of this.
Awesome. Thank you, Brian. All right. So I think the first place where we have to start, and this is really primarily a conversation that's going to probably be more impactful for US based listeners or listeners who have a US based population or employee population. There, of course, are some impacts around the world with some, US or federal government decisions. And we know that. But what we talk about today will really be primarily focused on US decision making, US governments, US legal practices, and things like that. So, first and foremost, the hot button topic is executive order. Now, obviously, once President Trump was inaugurated, and like I presume every other president preceding him, they just kind of bring up a bunch of executive orders, they sign, usually they switch pens. This is my very basic understanding of an executive order. Brian, can you help us to understand what is an executive order? What do they do?
Yeah, so I'm going to look at my notes for this because I want to make sure we're specific about this stuff. So, this is all paraphrasing, but this comes from the American Bar Association. So, an executive order is a directive issued by a president to manage the operations of the federal government. Broadly speaking, that is what an executive order is. It's not mentioned in the U.S. Constitution, but they are generally considered to be an implied power of the executive branch. So their scope, they are legally binding directives from the executive branch toward federal agencies, officials in the executive branch. They don't require approval from Congress, which is also why some of the limitations, as I'm sure everyone has been watching in the news, some of the limitations of the executive orders is they cannot establish or dissolve government agencies. That is Congress's job. So, like everything happening with USAID, sure, it can be gutted from the inside from an executive order, but it can't actually be dissolved without Congress deciding that's the case. So, broadly speaking, that's an executive order.
Got it. Thank you. It's helpful to understand, and also for listeners who are outside of the US, they might be like, what does all of this mean? Congress versus having a president. And maybe it's also helpful to explain that there, if I'm remembering correctly from my history classes, three branches of government. And the executive is one of them. And that is basically the federal government within that branch. Is that right?
Correct. And technically speaking, they're co-equal branches. So neither one acts as more of an emperor or an authority over any other. And that's where some of these issues are kind of getting into between Congress and the president right now. So that's yet to be
Right.
seen how all of that plays out.
Right. Well, this is an interesting point you make. Some of the things that I have seen, and I'm not looking to jump ahead. We're going to get back on the track here, but some of the things that I've seen, especially on LinkedIn, have been conversations around the president or the presidency, whomever is the president, having more more control or more power to assert than maybe Congress, let's say. Is that like a blanket statement that's fair? Is that incorrect?
Um, it's it's nuanced.
Mhm.
So I guess to that point, we can talk about an example that you and I have discussed previously. We saw a LinkedIn post a few weeks ago about um, the uh, the EEO, the Equal
The
Employment
EOC.
Opportunity
Yeah,
Act,
yeah.
being dissolved by executive order. Like we just talked about in defining an executive order, that's not possible. That's not something that the president can do. And so that's sort of some of the inaccuracies that unfortunately are spreading around about the authority that the president has, but also about the implications and what's happening. Because if you're of the mindset that the Equal Employment Opportunity Act has been dissolved, then you as a business may be making, you as an HR employee for a business may be making inaccurate decisions based on that inaccurate information.
Right. Super helpful. Thank you. And we'll probably come back to that. Um, let's talk about DE&I and HR, and specifically DE&I within businesses, let's say. I did an episode in 2024 when Sherm had basically said, "We're not gonna talk about equity anymore." And I was like, "WTF?" And, I tried in that episode. I haven't listened to it in a long time, so I don't remember if I was effective or not. But I tried in that episode to explain what diversity, what equity, and what inclusion actually mean. Because a big part of this is my opinion, I think, is that there's a huge misunderstanding in what DE&I actually is. And one of the things I believe you and I'm like looking at my notes here. I can't find it, but I think that you and I talked about, is there a difference between DE&I and affirmative action? And are people talking about DE&I? Are they talking about affirmative action? Are they talking about both? And I wonder if, while we're defining things, if we need to further understand what DE&I is, how it plays a role in organizations, if at all, and what affirmative action is, and if it plays a role in organizations, if at all. So, how do you want to start with that? Do you want to talk about DE&I first?
Sure. And I
It's a
think that
massive
that
topic. Yeah.
yeah, I think you make a good point there about how things get muddled
Yeah.
very easily, because yeah, affirmative action and DEI, DEIB, DEIA, any semblance of that, they are not the same. So DEI is and to be clear, has been around in a corporate setting, in nomenclature
Hmm.
for a long time. This is
Hmm.
not just the last 3 years or something. Um, Essentially, what it is it's internal corporate programs that prioritize, not with quotas, not with um, not with any discrimination against maybe people who look like me, to hire historically disadvantaged people into the workforce.
Hmm.
It's just inclusion. It's bringing in diversity from across the board and not disqualifying people who have been historically disqualified from jobs because they didn't look like me.
Hmm.
That is, again, broadly speaking, because every corporation can have a slightly different DEI policy. It's up to them how they want to do it. DEI, DEI by itself is not inherently an illegal policy. If you have quotas, if you say we need to hire for every 10 hires, 7 of them need to be minorities, and maybe you even go further and state exactly what those minorities need to be. That is potentially illegal. But simply having a DEI program, a program that says we are going to prioritize in our business, we are going to prioritize the inclusion uh, and the hiring of people from any background. We are not going to exclude people because they don't fit a certain mold that we have stuck in our heads. That, again, broadly speaking, is what DEI is at the private corporation level.
Amazing. Really helpful. And actually, I was thinking as you were sharing about this misunderstanding, and it's so interesting to me. You already mentioned the word nuance, which will probably say, it's like if I had a dollar for every time something was nuanced in the United States. Um, but obviously, making light of something very serious, like, what's so interesting to me, I always say this, more than one thing can be true at once. There's misunderstanding on both sides of the DEI argument. There's misunderstanding from those who are quote unquote against DE&I, whatever that means, because I don't think that people who say they're against DE&I really understand what it is. And that's okay. But, there's that like, oh my gosh, we're going to be shut out of jobs and opportunities because now we're the bad guys. I'm really like summarizing this very generally. I don't mean to offend anyone. If I am, I'm sorry. And then on the other side of the argument, people who are like, love DE&I, we need it everywhere, right? They might also have a misunderstanding of what DE&I is. And that's also okay, because as things evolve, and to your point, DE&I has been around for a very long time, we're talking about programmatic approaches to organizational development and employee experience. We're talking about HR. And as long as I've been in the workforce, I don't ever recall quotas for certain groups, either minorities or otherwise. And I think that's where, like, the one side, there's that belief that that's what's happening. And then again, on the other side of, the pro, let's say pro DE&I versus anti DE&I, the pro DE&I argument is also sometimes convoluted, because I think sometimes people outside of HR think that there should be quotas. And, this is where you see almost like the horseshoe effect in anything, but especially on the political spectrum, where everyone's kind of talking about the same kind of stuff, but not using the same dialect. And this is where I think like defining things can really help us to understand, well, what is my deeply held belief? Like the audience knows that DE&I is important to me because as an HR person, I believe that a diversity in thought and experience and industry and all of that, and race and religion and creed and all, it brings unique perspective. And equity ensures that people all have an equitable approach to opportunities. And inclusion ensures that people are actually at the table to have or to be afforded those opportunities. And this is where it's like, okay, if we take away, this is where it's like, how do we unveil our own emotions around things that are deeply impactful to people, in at least in their mind, body, and spirit? And so with that, understanding that it is okay to have a misunderstanding of DE&I, regardless of what side you're on. And if you're watching the video, you're seeing me do a lot of left and right here, but it's like, this is how I'm representing the different sides. How does DE&I then, now we have this understanding of the programmatic approach that DE&I is and has on organizations and has been around for a long time. How does that differ from something like affirmative action? And where do we see affirmative action today?
So I do want to address one thing that you said, and that is sort of the oftentimes unintentional misunderstanding of what DEI is. It is not in any way the discrimination against white men. It is not in any way the hiring of unqualified people over qualified people because the unqualified person happens to be a minority. That is not what DEI is. Um, in fact, I could make the argument and provide many examples for people who look like me who have been hired for positions and are not qualified, but are hired because they look like me. I think that when comparing affirmative action to DEI, I think it's important to also just state unequivocally that DEI is not a government mandated, government instituted, government policy of any kind. Affirmative action is. So again, I'm going to look at my notes here just to make sure we're being specific. Affirmative action, again, broadly speaking, refers to policies and practices designed oftentimes by the government to help address historical and systemic disadvantages to certain underrepresented groups in the workplace. It's more of a policy driven focus than it is a corporate initiative. If that's a clear enough distinction, I think DEI is more about cultural transformation and making the workplace look like the neighborhood,
Oh.
look like the country. Um, and affirmative action is a way to sort of help address some of those challenges that certain groups in this country have and continue to face today.
Mhm. That's really helpful, and I really like how you've helped us to understand where the government plays a role in terms of, like, mandates or regulations or policies versus where they don't. And I really think about DE&I like any other corporate or organizational focus. It's like, okay, if you wanna start offering workplace benefits or perks, it's you're taking a you're looking at DE&I when you do that. You're like, who's going to use this? How do we ensure it's inclusive? So if someone can't run or walk, they can expense a workplace, a wellness benefit, for example, for meditation, right? Like the DE&I is infused in so many things, and it has nothing to do with the government. Now, what I want to ask you specifically is, and I've gotten this question through DMs, emails, how does one or more of these executive orders, I know that there are dozens, how do these executive orders actually impact people in business today? What is the difference or the impact between the public and the private sector or government organizations, non-government organizations? Is there an impact?
Um, I mean, yes, there's always some level of impact. And to be clear, while DEI is not a government initiative or law, so to speak, like we just talked about, there are government agencies that do have DEI programs. And that is, to your point about executive orders, that is one of the executive orders that was signed on January 20th to, I think it was 60 or 90 days was the timeline provided. Every government agency had to dissolve its DEI programs, terminate people working under those programs, employees in DEI, not those who were hired under programs. So the impact there initially is for the government. Now, the administration has made very clear, both from executive orders, but also from a note from the Attorney General Pam Bondi last week or the week before, um, a formal memo where she basically put private employers on notice. Um, and so there's, from my perspective and some of the conversations that I'm having with clients and other people in this space, is what do we do? Right? Like these may not impact us yet, but they might. So do we need to just wait for things to settle? Do we need to be proactive and take some steps? And I don't think either approach is wrong. Um, Personally, I do advocate for not being reactive to some of this stuff. I definitely suggest to clients that we just take a minute, evaluate your DEI program. Let's understand. Let's take a look at it. Let's audit it. Let's make sure that there's no quotas in there or anything like that that are really red flags. But otherwise, let's wait, because as we talked about, there were numerous executive orders signed on January 20th. There were also numerous lawsuits brought on January 20th. So we need to wait for some of these things. There have been stays issued in certain circumstances on some of the executive orders. So we do just need to wait and let things settle and sort of understand. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be prepared for something going one direction or another or modified from the original executive order. So that's where it's important to understand where your business is. And I will make one caveat here, because we're making distinctions, which is good, between sort of the government and private employers. But there are private companies that have government contracts. And generally speaking, in order to get those government contracts, you agree to adhere to certain terms of the government. And those might include executive orders disbanding DEI programs. So for those employers, there might be more urgency on what do we do. And again, I would say the same thing. Audit your DEI program. Make sure that there's nothing like quotas or anything that's discriminatory within it. And then you have to determine, here's some of the political part, you have to determine how much of a stance you want to take. If you're of the mindset that DEI has been beneficial to your business, then maybe you keep things as is, and you stand your ground and you say our DEI program is entirely legal until Congress passes a law that says you can't have DEI programs in private companies. This is what we have. If you're not quite of that mindset and you want to disband your DEI program, you're well within your rights to do that. But don't think that you have to do that even if you have federal contractors or you have a contract with the federal government, because as long as your DEI program is not discriminatory, and to be clear, maybe this is something we should have said at the beginning, discrimination in hiring is illegal.
Illegal.
And so there is no discrimination happening here. That's I think the ultimate point. And as long as your program adheres to that rule, to that law, then even if you have government contracts, you technically are fine. Does that mean you might get sued under this administration? Yeah, you might. So that's what I mean at the beginning when I said, it's kind of a balancing act, and talk to your people about your specific situation to understand sort of how hard you want to push and what you're prepared to change within your organization.
Very informational and very helpful. I have a couple questions, and these are not questions that I already know the answer to. I just want to preface this. These are like real questions that I have for you. I don't have them written down. Let's say in the event that there is a company in the private sector, we'll be very clear here with this example. I don't know that this is true. I'm just making this up. A company in the private sector that has quotas today and says, okay, well, we, in an effort to diversify our workforce, we want X number of people, 30% of our population to be from this race, 51% of our population to be female, and X percentage of candidates going through the recruitment process that are reflective of those percentages. So one male versus one female at every final interview process. Let's just say I could see where the quotas could be well intended. If someone's like, I really want to diversify my workforce, and so I want there to be representation in the candidate process in order to do that. So maybe it's less about quotas at the end of the process where I'm kind of asking two things here, and this is just how complicated this topic is sometimes in my mind. So maybe I'll break it down. Like if there's a company that's doing that, even if they're well intended, is that legal for them to do? Like just on the surface without having any other information, obviously, because this is like a fake example that I'm using. Because I ask that because even if the intentions are good, my understanding is that that's not actually an effective way of diversifying your workforce. Obviously, you need to have representation, but that could be grounds for being illegal in the understanding of what is discriminatory versus what isn't, even if the intention is to diversify. Am I off base with that? Do you think there's something like that out there?
I've definitely seen companies with that for sure, and you're right. The intention can be pure, but the result is still a violation, or potentially in this scenario a violation of the law. I don't recommend quotas generally.
No.
I mean, I'll give an example here of and this may not even be a great example, but let's run with it. Jury selection has to be under the Constitution, under Supreme Court precedent. Jury selection, the jury pool has to be representative of the residents in that community. So if you live in a community that is, say, 70% minority, and then you have a jury pool and it's 90% white, that would be against the law.
Right.
That would not be representative of the community. Now, to be clear, the jury itself can be all white. It's the pool that has to be representative of the community, not the final jury.
Oh, yeah. That's interesting. Right. Okay. Interesting.
So that's where like it is kind of a quasi quota in that regard.
Hmm.
But I wouldn't recommend that type of approach for companies because, like you said, quotas quotas make it much more likely that there's discrimination happening.
Yeah.
And it puts it on the face. It's right there in front of you. And so that I don't recommend quotas. To your point, there are a multitude of ways to have a solid, effective DEI program within your organization, that addresses the culture, not just having a certain number of different races on your team.
Totally. You know, with DE&I, a lot of what comes up is this concept of representation, and that, let's take an example of a woman going through an interview process. If they never interview with another woman, then it's like, well, where's the representation? This comes up a lot. And I think it's a good example of how DE&I is, in my mind at least, and it kind of goes back to what you said, more about how a company operates in terms of like what their culture is, what they want the employee experience to be. And I feel like it's important to note that this, as you said, this has been around for a long time. Companies that care about having diversity, especially in thought, because people of the same background are not, they could also have diverse thoughts like from one another depending on how they grew up. I don't want to get too convoluted in this, but companies that care about having different voices and different people on their team and different backgrounds have always cared about those things and probably will always care about those things and will always care about DE&I. And I think when you and I first spoke about doing this episode, I even said, well, just like any good consumer, if you go and you do research on a product, or in this case, a company that you're considering applying for. Sorry, everyone, you're probably going to hear babies crying in the background. If I wait any longer, we might be waiting for another 30 minutes at this point. They're okay. They're with a caregiver. They are fine. They just woke up cranky from a nap. But anyway, what I was saying is that with any good consumer approach, you're going to do research into the job, hopefully, or the company that you are applying for. And if you see that they don't have a diversity statement, you look at their, C-suite, and you don't see representation that you believe that is important to you, or that you believe you should see for the company, depending on their size or whatever, then you can and you have the ability to make decisions for yourself. Now, obviously, that's notwithstanding if someone is in need of a job. They might not be, first looking at that or caring about that. They're just looking for employment. And I get that. But at the end of the day, if everyone's worried about seed oils, you're not going to continue to buy stuff with seed oils, right? And if you're concerned about DE&I and you want there to be representation that's reflective of your own background or your preferences or whatever, you should also do that and be the consumer that you want to be. Now, with that, I want to know, like, from your perspective, and maybe even from what some of your clients have shared. You've already talked about what happens now, like, let's hit pause, let's take a step back from being reactive. What do like how does this impact us today? Do we take the same approach as individuals within businesses in terms of, really just taking a pause, taking a beat to see what sticks?
That's kind of where I'm at today. Now, as we all know, things are moving rapidly, and that could change by the time we end this recording. But that is my approach today, and I say that because of all the legal challenges that are working their way through. And these are not like, big tobacco lawsuits that are going to take 15 years to finalize. These are things that the courts are prioritizing and are fast tracked. I would anticipate in the next week or two that there will be cases before the Supreme Court already, that they may at least accept. They may not hear them yet, but they may at least accept them for the upcoming term. But I think that's kind of my approach right now. Is to start thinking about these things. That's why we're having this conversation today, to start thinking about what it is, where my business wants to go, where is my stance, where's the line for me. Do I have a DEI program? Am I thinking about implementing one? If I already have one, is it compliant? Is it discriminatory in any way? Do I need to make any changes to it? Those are the things to start thinking about. I don't think, again, in this moment on Valentine's Day, I don't think there's any action that needs to be taken outside of companies that maybe have quotas, because I think there's so much yet to settle. And even if um, the president and the attorney general get their way, and they want to start suing private private corporations, which actually has already happened in Missouri this past week. The Missouri AG filed suit against a company for having quotas in their DEI program.
Got it. Got it.
So even if the AG and the president get their way, it might be slightly different than what they want. Now, will the courts, will they listen to the courts? That's yet to be said, because the administration has said they won't. So, that is a totally different discussion. But I think waiting to see where things fall, waiting to see where things settle, I think things are going to change a little bit. But again, having those internal discussions, having those discussions with your employment counsel, having those discussions with HR consultants and advisors inside of your HR team, and figuring out, being prepared for, if this happens, then this is what we're going to do. Not thinking about every possible scenario, that's pointless. But broadly speaking, thinking about, do we need to make any adjustments to our program? And a lot of companies, here's another important point that I think a lot of companies need to hear, is that they should have data on their workforce. A lot of corporations, especially smaller businesses under 50, just don't have that data. Now, today it's easier to pull when you're using an online payment system for your payroll. You can run reports pretty easily on stuff like that. But it's good to have that information, not only internally to understand where you are as a corporation in your diversity and inclusion efforts, but also to be able to defend yourself against any potential lawsuits from the government or the state that may want to force you to disband your equity and inclusion.
Very interesting. This actually makes me think about like states like California that require, if you have, I think it's over 100 employees, uh, maybe I'm wrong about that. Double check me if you're like using this as fact, where you have to submit information, anonymized, but information about your workforce as part of the EEO-1. I think it's the EEO-1 reporting. It's part of the uh, EEO, I guess. Either it's at the state level. That's my understanding, but um, it's interesting because, you have to also provide information on your contractors. Like these are all things that from an HR standpoint, like we should be doing from a compliance standpoint already, is like really understanding, to your point, how the employee population breaks down. And I also, not to belabor that point, but when I think about the HR responsibility, just fundamentally, when it comes to government decisions, anything related to compliance, anything that could become, go from an executive order to then, a congressional discussion and effectively a law at some point, or a new policy, there is a responsibility on those of us who manage or mitigate compliance to really understand what's going on and also be a part of the solution. And I say that because I think we have to siphon out some of the noise. When you mentioned it at the top of this recording, that we saw from a few people already, HR thought leaders, very well respected leaders in general, on LinkedIn and other places, talking about things that are not accurate, like the dissolution of the EEO Act, which is just not what's, at least hopefully, not what's happening. And there's a responsibility that we all have. I have especially this responsibility as having a podcast and talking into the ether, every week. You have to either you have to say, "Hey, fact check me," or you have to provide resources, or I should say and or you need to not spread information that isn't categorically true. Because what happens is then the noise that is already, I want to say deafening, but in a way, it's just like there's just so much. It can be very overwhelming. And what ends up happening is that noise translates to fear. And I just don't subscribe to a fear-based reaction. It's like, okay, what is happening here? Like everyone was like messaging me, "Are you going to talk about DEI?" I'm like, "Let's all just relax for a moment. Let's figure out what it is that we have to talk about," which is why you're here today, because there's so much. We can't It's just so counterproductive to, raise up our arms and be reactive and be afraid, because all that does is we then, like, we're doom scrolling and we're like, "Oh my gosh, this person said this is happening. This person said that all of my rights are going away. This person said the EEO Act is dissolving." And what ends up happening is we know how social media works. We only then end up getting our own information that could also still be false. And so there's a responsibility that we have as thought leaders, as people who put information out there, to just, like, make sure that it's either accurate in that moment or that it's reflective as an opinion, or as someone's own fear. And so with that diatribe that I've just shared, taking a step off of my soapbox for a moment, what do you say to someone or to people who are afraid presently, who are afraid that they are losing their rights like, especially those who are part of marginalized groups? What do you say to them, to people who are afraid, to people who worry that they are now going to be, uh, regressed in terms of their place within organizations and within their career? Like, what do you say to the fear?
I want to step on your soapbox for a second
Please
because
push it toward you.
you the word you just used and used a minute ago in your
Diatribe, you could say
yeah.
it.
This will be a political statement. And if my politics weren't clear already, here they are. Fear is the point. This administration wants to put fear in people they see as other, they see as illegitimate. Um, that is the point. That is the point of so many of these executive orders. Um, and I don't, it's hard to know what to say to people because it is fearful. It is terrifying for some people.
Mhm,
And not everybody has the ability to change jobs, to pick
mhm,
up and move to a bluer state. If you do, certainly go for it. Vote with your tax dollars. Like, I think that for some people, they need to just hear that there are people out there who support them and who
mhm,
are willing to advocate for them. Again, to go back to something I said earlier, that's why I have over the past couple of weeks tried to be so loud about this, because I feel like it's my responsibility as someone who could potentially benefit from these executive orders and these law changes, to speak out, not only to try and push back against some of these, but also to provide that support to these marginalized communities,
mhm,
to let them know that there are people out here, who, don't get me wrong, I can't walk in your shoes. I can, to a point, I can empathize with you and what you've been through, but I will never 100% know. But know that people like me are out there fighting and pushing back, um, to try and reduce some of that fear, to try and make people feel comfortable, not only in their own skin but also at work, where they can be themselves. And I think I don't know how much comfort that is, and It's probably a little unfulfilling in a response, but I do think that there are good people out there. There are good companies out there, and even if you right now feel stuck where you are, know that a door may open tomorrow, and there are other places that you can go.
I mean, stay on that soapbox. It does make me think about this is again summarizing and generalizing in a way that's just take it for what it's worth. These rollbacks, if they happen, I don't believe that that means that companies tomorrow will start to discriminate against people. Do you think that's fair to say?
I think it's fair to say with a disclaimer that
Mhm.
there will be some companies that are looking to discriminate. There will
Okay.
be some
Well,
companies that want to go back to the 1950s or even the 1850s.
you know what's so funny about that is that, in the 1950s, women had their place in the world, so people thought. And yet, even now, there are still my point here. I'm gonna be clear about it at the end. Even now, with DE&I and other, regulatory change, not other because DE&I is not regulatory, but DEI and regulatory things and policies, women are still subjugated. And I say that with a chuckle because my point is that I think that I always look to find inspiration for people. This is just who I am. I don't try to make light of serious things because I know that this is serious for many people at many levels. So please don't mistake my like finding the bright side as like being out of touch. That's not what's happening here. I'm very in touch with everything. I I think this is where we as people whatever whatever groups we are a part of, whether we're marginalized or we're not marginalized, this is where we have an impact. We can, you know there there were times where people of certain backgrounds, races, creeds, genders were not welcome in places. To your point, there are places that hope for that to return. They probably have always felt that way. And there were places that always did the right thing. And so I think this is where like we as individual on an individual level and as HR people, we have the ability, to your point, to be like to lend an ear, to express advocacy for a person or a group. We have the opportunity to really continue to transform workplaces. This is like when I think about the ethos of my podcast, I started it in the fall of 2020 because I was sick and tired of scrolling on like, oh god, I hate to say it, Clubhouse. I used to participate in that godforsaken thing, Clubhouse, and like LinkedIn and other social media, and everyone, especially HR leaders, okay, not everyone, that's a blanket statement. A lot of people that I saw were engaging in conversations about furloughs and layoffs and COVID from the basis of numbers and company decisions. And I was like, is everyone delusional? There are people at the core of this, you know? And so this is where like if I really come back to the reason why this podcast exists today, it is for all of us in HR or outside of HR because everyone contributes to what a workplace is like. We have the opportunity to make things right for people, regardless of whether a government tells us to do it or not. And this is like, I say the same thing with, any type of regulation. Like, there's a minimum wage, pay more than that. Like, regulations are important. And I think you and I talked about this offline. Regulations are really important to ensure that businesses are fair. Like just fundamentally that people are treated fairly and that businesses operate fairly. Very fundamental. It is not a playbook for companies. Companies have to determine what is the right thing
What is going to drive the most engagement from people? How do I treat people with respect and dignity and consideration? And that, to me, is DE&I. But that is how you ensure that these things, are not so scary because you still have control. Now, obviously, there's an asterisk there in the event that there is a law that affects a particular company or sector of companies, or, as you mentioned, if there are government contracts. So that's notwithstanding all of that. But we all have we all make an impact, and we all have the opportunity to make an impact. I again, not intending to like look at the world with rose-colored glasses and make everyone feel invalidated, not my goal. I just like to see the opportunity even for myself in terms of how I influence my own company, you know?
And
Am
I
I
think
like totally off base?
no, I think that's an important point. I will suck up to you for a second and say the whole reason I found your podcast was because of the tagline. And
Oh,
I
there you
think
go.
I think I found it around the holidays in 2020. So you hadn't been
Oh,
doing it that long.
yeah.
But that was the whole reason I started listening to it. But it's an important point that you make because there's a there's oftentimes a disconnect between what HR used to be and what it is today.
Mhm.
And what it used to be was a company asset protection division. Today, to your point, it's about people um, in the corporations that prioritize their people. I've said, and I may have even said this last time I was on your podcast, that even if you're a mean spirited business owner and you don't care about your people, you don't care about your employees, you don't care if they're happy, healthy, engaged employees, I can show you the data that says you should. Because if you have healthy, happy, engaged employees, you have productive employees that make you more money. And if that's your ultimate goal is to make more money and you don't care at all about your team, you should, because the end result is still what you want. That
Mhm.
is the best way to get there. But
Amen.
there are so many companies that are taking the mindset shift that has happened not just over the last 4 years for sure, but over the last couple of decades, moving from HR as a company asset protection division to a true people experience, a people and culture division that fights for better benefits, that bridges the gap between what potentially greedy business owners want and what employees need to be able to provide for their kids, to be able
Yeah.
to buy the products that they're helping to make. This is a different approach, and part of that encompasses inclusion, diversity, bringing together people of all sorts of different backgrounds and experiences, because that also helps grow a business. When you have just a bunch of white dudes sitting in there, they've all had pretty much the same background and lived experience. But when you've got a diverse team
That's right.
coming to a table to solve a problem with your market or your product or whatever it is, you're going to have so many different approaches and opinions and suggestions on how to go about this, that it's actually going to enrich the environment, enrich the process, and ultimately enrich your business.
Totally. Amen to all of that. And, as you were sharing this, I was like, minimum wage is like such a poor example of how businesses can do the right thing. But parental leave is the perfect example. FMLA is 12 measly weeks. Like meager. Businesses have the ability to do more. And you're either going to find organizations that do just that, or maybe they're not even, eligible for FMLA and they don't even offer parental leave. That's certainly a commonality. Or you have businesses that offer more. And actually, parental leave, not even talking about maternity versus paternity, parental leave is a perfect example of DE&I in the workplace. Because sure, there is a policy side of things in terms of regulation and federal programming and state pay and all of that stuff. But businesses that want a more diverse organization. I'm really sorry for the babies in the background. I think it's probably dinner time. Um, the companies that want a more diverse workforce offer better benefits like that because they know that it's very possible that women won't really work for them if they don't have a strong maternity leave. And hopefully there are fathers out there who won't really want to work for them because they don't have a strong paternity leave. And on the flip side of that, when you see you like if there again coming back to this, if there's a diversity statement, if you see that there's a 16-week parental leave, I know that like for those listeners who are not in the US, especially those in Canada, they're like 16 weeks. That's all you get when they get like a year. But 16 weeks is considered like a richer benefit in the United States. And so I think I hope we accomplish what we set out to accomplish on this episode. We for me at least as the host and owner of this podcast, I really try with every episode with every guest to challenge how we think and really have a deeper understanding of how our responsibility and what we can do about different decisions that are either made for us or that are coming up, and how we better understand everything. So with that, Bryan, do you want to kind of share where everyone can find you and connect? And of course, we're going to see you back again in a month for our policy polls, which I'm really excited about.
Yeah, absolutely. I before I get to that, I will say I want to wrap up and say just 3 points for listeners that are sort of the key points at this point, at this stage, as of February 14th, with everything that's happening. And that is to conduct a policy audit. It's good to do this annually anyway, but do it now, specifically for any DEI and hiring policies that you have. If you have any questions at all, seek legal guidance, contact someone like me, an HR consultant or advisor, talk to your internal team, figure out what steps you need to take. And then hopefully continue to foster an inclusive culture through fairness and equal opportunity, ensuring that anyone and every employee that you hire feels valued and welcomed in your organization. I think those are the 3 things that people should do right now in preparation for a lot of the changes. So where can you find me? My website is just my name, brianjdriscoll.com. I spell my name with a Y, not to be confused with the acting FBI director, who is also Brian J. Driscoll, but
Oh my
with an I.
gosh.
Yeah,
Wow.
scary when I Google my name. I'm also on LinkedIn. I don't do a ton of social media, but I am on LinkedIn. Brian John Driscoll is my handle there.
Amazing. And is there a place or a resource where listeners can go in order to have a better understanding of some of these policies or changes that are potentially happening, or where they can get their best, where can they get like the most factual information?
Yeah. So outside of having someone you can lean on, call, email, text for your specific questions, outside of that, to get general, broad updates on what's happening and possible guidance, again, general guidance on how to move forward, look for employment law firms. There are some major national employment law firms that send out weekly newsletters focused on
Right.
employment topics. If you're in a big city, especially in a bluer state, look at local employment law firms who will also have newsletters, and they will be tailored to both the federal level, what's happening, and how your state and city might be trying to counteract some of what's happening at the federal level.
Got it. Bryan, thank you so much for joining me on this episode and for coming up with this fabulous idea of the Policy Pulse. I'm really excited for our first official series episode next month. And I just am so grateful to you and for your expertise, because I knew that this topic really required really a lot of care. Like, we need to understand everything. We have to have clear understanding of what it is that we're talking about, what the potential impact is. And I just really am super grateful to have you, join us for this and be able to share, all of your insights. So thank you again.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. I love coming on and having these discussions. I enjoy it. I do think it is, to your point though, it is sometimes difficult, especially with this topic, but it's just being human, I think ultimately is what people need to do. They just need to be human.
Totally. Amen to that. And thank you to the listeners for being open throughout this conversation. I know it's a lot and there's still going to be a lot to talk about. So thank you to all of you who made it to the bitter end here at the 1 hour mark, pretty much. Amazing. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you're catching this episode, and we will see you next week.
Hey, just before you go, don't forget to subscribe to this show so that you are the first to hear when an episode drops each week. And maybe leave a 5-star review and a comment about how much you loved this episode. Plus, if you have someone in mind who would really enjoy this episode, make sure you share it with them. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next week.